the issue today, the judiciary, as well as we're talking about the Attorney General's office. And so I'll have plenty of time to ask the questions I know you desperately want to ask about everything from the 25th Amendment on, but I'm not going to speak to that today. I want this to be the issue that we focus on because I think it's so important. Yesterday, in my view, one of the darkest days in the history of our nation. An unprecedented assault on our democracy. An assault literally on the citadel of liberty in the United States Capitol itself. An assault on the rule of law. An assault on the most sacred of American undertakings, ratifying the will of the people in choosing the leadership of their government. All of us here grieve the loss of life, grieve the desecration of the people's house. But what we witnessed yesterday was not dissent, it was not disorder, it was not protest, it was chaos. They weren't protesters. Don't dare call them protesters. They were a riotous mob, insurrectionists, domestic terrorists. It's that basic, it's that simple. And I wish we could say we couldn't see it coming. But that isn't true. We could see it coming. The past 4 years, we've had a president who's made his contempt for our democracy, our Constitution, the rule of law, clear in everything he has done. He unleashed an all-out assault on our institutions of our democracy from the outset. And yesterday was but the culmination of that unrelenting attack. He's attacked the free press, who dared to question his power, repeatedly calling the free press the enemy of the people. Language, at the time he first used it, I and others said, has long been used by autocrats and dictators all over the world to hold on to power, the enemy of the people. Language that is being used now by autocrats and dictators across the world, only this time with the imperator of an outgoing president of the United States of America. He's attacked our intelligence services, who dared tell the American people the truth about the effort of a foreign power to elect him 4 years ago, choosing instead to believe the word of Vladimir Putin over the word of those who've sworn their allegiance to this nation, many of whom had risked their lives in the service of this nation. He deployed the United States military, tear-gassing peaceful protesters in pursuit of a photo opportunity in the service of his re-election, even holding the Bible upside down. The action that led to an apology from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and an outspoken denunciation of the use of military for domestic political purposes from scores of former military leaders and secretaries of defense, led by Secretary Cheney. He thought he could stack the courts with friendly judges who would support him no matter what. They were Trump judges, his judges. He went so far as to say he needed 9 justices on the Supreme Court because he thought the election would end up in the Supreme Court and they would hand him the election. He was stunned, truly stunned, when the judges he appointed didn't do his bidding, instead acted with integrity, following the Constitution, upholding the rule of law, not just once or twice or 3 times, but over 60 times. Let me say it, over 60 times. In more than 60 cases, in state after state after state. And then at the Supreme Court, as judges, including people considered, quote, his judges, Trump judges, use his words, looked at the allegations that Trump was making and determined they were without any merit. Nothing was judged to put this election in question or doubt by any of these judges. You want to understand the importance of democratic institutions in this country? Take a look at the judiciary in this nation. Take a look at the pressure it was just subjected to by a sitting president of the United States of America. At every level, the judiciary rose to the moment during this election, did its job, acted with complete fairness and impartiality, with complete honor and integrity. When history looks back in this moment that we've just passed through, I believe it will say our democracy survived in no small part because of the men and women who represent an independent judiciary in this nation. We owe them a deep, deep debt of gratitude. And then there's the attack on the Department of Justice, treating the Attorney General as his personal lawyer and the department as his personal law firm. Through it all, we would hear the same thing from this president. My generals, my judges, my Attorney General. And then yesterday, a culmination of an attack on our institutions of democracy. This time, the Congress itself, inciting a mob to attack the Capitol, to threaten elected representatives of the people of this nation, and even the Vice President, to stop the Congress from ratifying the will of the American people in a just completed free and fair election. Trying to use a mob to silence the voices of nearly 160 million Americans who summoned the courage in the face of a pandemic that threatened their health and their lives to cast that sacred ballot. I made it clear from the moment I entered this race that what I believe was at stake. I said there was nothing less at stake than who we are as a nation, what we stand for, what we believe, what we will be. At the center of that belief is one of the oldest principles this nation has long held. We are a government of laws, not of men, not of the people, of laws. I said it many times in the campaign. Our democratic institutions are not relics of another age. They're what sets this nation apart. They're the guardrails of our democracy. And there is no president. That's why there is no president who is a king. No Congress that's a House of Lords. A judiciary doesn't serve the will of the president or exist to protect him or her. We have three co-equal branches of government. Co-equal. Our president is not above the law. Justice serves the people. It doesn't protect the powerful. Justice is blind. What we saw yesterday, in plain view, was another violation of the fundamental tenet of this nation. Not only do we see the failure to protect one of the three branches of our government, we also saw a clear failure to carry out equal justice. I don't know if you used to say in the Senate, excuse a point of personal privilege. A little over an hour and a half after the chaos started, I got a text from my granddaughter, Finnegan Biden, who's a senior in her last semester at the University of Pennsylvania. She sent me a photo of military people in full military gear, scores of them lining the steps of the Lincoln Memorial because of protests by Black Lives Matter. She said, "Pop, this isn't fair. No one can tell me that if had been a group of Black Lives Matter protesting yesterday, they wouldn't have been treated very, very differently than the mob of thugs that stormed the Capitol." We all know that's true. And it is unacceptable, totally unacceptable. The American people saw it. plain view, and I hope it sensitizes them to what we have to do. Not many people know it. When Justice Garland and I were talking, we talked about, I think he raised it, the reason for the Justice Department was formed in the first place. It was back in 1870. We didn't have a Justice Department before that, the cabinet. It was formed in 1870 to enforce the Civil Rights Amendment that grew out of the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, to stand up to the Klan, to stand up to racism, to take on domestic terrorism. This original spirit must again guide and animate its work. So as we stand here today, we do so in the wake of yesterday's events that could not more have vividly demonstrated some of the most important work we have to do in this nation. Committing ourselves to the rule of law in this nation, invigorating our domestic and democratic institutions, carrying out equal justice under the law in America. There is no more important place for us to do this work than the Department of Justice that has been so politicized. There's no more important people to carry out this work than the people I'm announcing today. More than anything, we need to restore the honor, the integrity, the independence of the Department of Justice in this nation that's been so badly damaged. And so many former leaders of that department in both parties have so testified and stated that. I want to be clear to those who lead this department who you will serve. You won't work for me. You are not the president or the vice president's lawyer. Your loyalty is not to me. It's to the law, the Constitution, the people of this nation, to guarantee justice. For Attorney General of the United States, I nominate a man of impeccable integrity, Judge Merrick Garland, one of the most respected jurists of our time, brilliant yet humble, distinguished yet modest, full of character and decency. A Supreme Court clerk, served in the Justice Department during the Carter, Bush 41, and Clinton administrations, where he embraced the department's core values of independence and integrity. A federal prosecutor who took on terrorism and corruption and violent crime, always with the utmost professionalism and the duty to the oath he swore. Nominated by President Clinton to be a judge on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, considered the second most powerful court in America. Throughout such a long and distinguished career, Judge Garland has earned the praise and admiration of members of bench and bar and politicians of both parties. And despite his busy schedule and prestigious positions, he still makes time to volunteer regularly, tutoring students in Northeast D.C., as he's done for 20 years. It's about character. It's about character. It was no surprise why President Obama nominated him, Judge Garland, to the Supreme Court. As I said, he embodies honor, decency, integrity, fidelity to the rule of law, and judicial independence. To those same traits, he will now bring as Attorney General of the United States, not as a personal attorney of the President, the people's lawyer. He'll restore trust in the rule of law and equal justice under the law. And I fully expect, in discussions I've had, that he will receive a fair hearing and swift confirmation. And once he's confirmed, I will move promptly to nominate his replacement on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals.
Will Dupree here again in the KXAN Live studio. We are interrupting President-elect Joe Biden's remarks after he called the rioters who broke into the Capitol yesterday domestic terrorists. We are going to jump now over to Speaker Nancy Pelosi's remarks in D.C. Let's take a listen now.
Of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as President and Vice President of the United States. Despite the desecration of our Capitol, we upheld in front of the country and the world the bedrock principle that the people are sovereign and that they hold the power to choose their leaders through the ballot, rejecting this attempted coup on the part of President Trump and his supporters. Accountability is also needed for Republicans in Congress who promoted the extreme conspiracy theories that provoked the violence, encouraged the mob, and who, after desecration of the Capitol, went back to the House floor and continued to push the falsehoods and underpinned this assault that underpinned this assault on our democracy. These Republicans abdicated their oath of office that was taken just 3 days prior to protect the American people and to support and defend the Constitution of the United States. The House worked through the evening and into the morning to nearly 4 a.m. to validate the electoral count, again proclaiming Joe Biden and Kamala Harris as the duly elected President and Vice President of the United States. I just want to say how proud I am of my members. For a while now, our 4 scholars, we call them Jamie Raskin, Zoe Lofgren, the chair of the Committee of Jurisdiction, Adam Schiff, and Joe Neguse, set forth a plan that was about the Constitution. It wasn't about Donald Trump and all the reasons he shouldn't be president. He was not part of this. It was about the Constitution and how we are a country of law. We are not a monarchy with a king, as Jamie has said over and over again. I want to also thank the members of the Arizona delegation, led by Raul Grijalva, and the Pennsylvania delegation, led by Mike Doyle, the 2 deans, for the presentations that they made to refute the ridiculous statements being made by our colleagues. For what reason, I don't know, but it wasn't about reason. So I thank them for them. And through all of this week, our swearing in on Sunday, passing our rule and preparing for Wednesday as the week began, the election of 2 Democrats in Georgia because of the overwhelming participation of people at the grassroots level. So many people. I'm so proud of our House members. Congresswoman Williams, the chair of the Georgia Democratic Party, Lucy McBath, the newly elected Carolyn Bordeaux, David Scott, Mr. Bishop, who was the dean of that delegation, and Hank Johnson. Well, they had their plan already should they have objected to Georgia, as did Nevada, as did Michigan, as did Wisconsin. So we were prepared. Members worked hard about defending the Constitution, honoring our purpose to count and ascertain the Electoral College numbers for the presidency. So I was proud of him. And I did over and over again. We're very pleased now that we have, in 13 days, President Joe Biden, a Democratic House majority, and a Democratic Senate majority that will work to heal and restore the soul of our nation. I will close by evoking, as I did last night, the Song of St. Francis, our patron saint in San Francisco, whose Song of St. Francis is our city's anthem. Lord, make me a channel of thy peace. Where there is darkness, may we bring light. Where there is hatred, love, despair, hope. The list goes on. And so does the time for healing take us down a path of unity for our country. With that, I'd be pleased to take any questions. Yes, ma'am.
Speaker Pelosi, would you encourage cabinet members not to resign so that they can invoke the 25th Amendment?
No, but let's go over that list. Why wouldn't they, if you're a member of the cabinet, a secretary in the cabinet, you're in a line of succession to the presidency, president, vice president, speaker of the House, Senate leader, pro tem, and then Secretary of State. When, just for the information of some, when you have the 25th Amendment invoked, that would be calling upon the Vice President, as we hope to do, to take the lead, and with a majority of the cabinet, to be able to unseat the President of the United States. A very dangerous person who should not continue in office. This is urgent. This is emergency of the highest magnitude. So you're Pompeo, the Secretary of State. Do you stand by this president dangerously staying in office? Secretary of the Treasury, Mnuchin. What is it? Is it about success in business later, or is it, do you believe in this? Do we have the list? I know it because I know it. Then the way it goes is Saint Dapiakalhu. That's a mnemonic. Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Defense. The acting Secretary of Defense. I don't know what authority he may have, but he certainly has to answer for where the National Guard was yesterday. Secretary of, then Attorney General. Attorney General Barr, do you subscribe to the presidency of Donald Trump after the act of sedition he committed yesterday? It's next Postmaster General, but that's in when our founders put it together. Interior. The list goes on. Ask each member of the cabinet, do they stand by these actions? Are they ready to say, in the next 13 days, this dangerous man can do further harm to our country, an assault on our democracy, on the first branch of government? Rosen, we spoke to yesterday. Why would he not? Why would he not, as the acting AG, say this is wrong? There are some courageous Republicans who are speaking out. I salute Secretary of Defense Bill Cohen and others defense secretaries who've signed the letter, even before yesterday, about what is going on in the White House and how that is not a good thing for our country, and the message that it sent to the world. A complete tool of Putin, this president is. Putin's goal was to diminish the role of the view of democracy in the world. That's what he has been about. And again, his enabler has been Donald Trump for a long time. That's why I said in that photo when I'm leaving his meeting, with you, Mr. President, all roads lead to Putin. Putin wants to undermine democracy. That's what he's about domestically and internationally. And the president gave him the biggest of all of his many gifts to Putin, the biggest gift yesterday. My friends, we are in a very difficult place in our country as long as Donald Trump still sits in the White House. Yes, yes.
You said you may be forced to pursue impeachment. Under what circumstances would you do that, and how long would you give this 25th Amendment process to play out before going down that road?
Well, it's a simple matter. In terms of the Constitution, the Vice President, working with the Cabinet, more than 50% of the Cabinet, can immediately improve the security of our country. That doesn't happen Jamie Raskin has passed legislation that enables another step in the 25th Amendment process. The 25th Amendment process is when it is determined that the president is unfit for whatever reason to be president of the United States, in case some people don't know what that is. And he clearly has indicated that over and over again. And by inciting sedition, as he did yesterday, he must be removed from office. While it's only 13 days left, any day can be a horror show for America. So the next step would be that Congress, and this can be done quickly, can establish a commission very fast of maybe former presidents, cabinet people who know something about health, the health of the president and the rest, and that group can make its recommendations to the Congress. The list goes on. Having said that, the best route, the most immediate route, would be the vice president to recognize the danger of the Donald Trump presidency and take this action. A. B. My members are very much interested, as are my phone is exploding with impeach, impeach, impeach. The president must be held accountable again. He likes.
Madam Speaker,
We would be prepared to do that, but I don't have immediate plans because we haven't even been to sleep since the folly of the Republicans deciding we should go until 4 o'clock in the morning for no purpose whatsoever except to be enablers of the president's sedition by undermining the elections. Imagine that, the President of the United States undermining the elections in our country. So in any event, we would be prepared.
How long are you willing to give Pence? 24 hours, 48 hours?
Just how realistic
I don't
is
know
this
how
timeline?
quickly he might respond. We'll see. And that could be
You said
quick.
there's great urgency. The clock is
Yes.
clearly ticking. There's 13 days.
That's right.
How long are you willing to give the cabinet and Pence until they make a
Well, I
decision
think
before
that they
you
will.
start your own procedure?
I don't think that it'll take long to get an answer from the vice president. It'll either be yes or it will be no, and we'll see. But we want to make sure.
Today? Do you expect an answer today?
We would hope. We would hope. But Mr. Schumer, the new majority leader of the Senate, and I have made our interest in this known. So we'll see what they come back with. But they have to answer for it. And in answering for whether they're prepared to do that, they are answering for the behavior of Donald Trump.
Maybe on the floor next week. We
I'm
just
sorry,
have questions
yes, sir.
on the floor next week. The security breaches here. Chuck Schumer's talking about firing the sergeant at arms over there. Are you thinking of a similar step over here? What are you going to do to address the security breaches on the Capitol?
Well, let me just say that is a very important question. Let me hold for a moment because it is not, we have to do the after-action review. I am calling for the resignation of the chief of the Capitol Police, Mr. Sund, and I have received notice from Mr. Irving that he will be submitting his resignation. Having said that, we have the after-action review, but it goes beyond the Capitol Police. It goes to the FBI. What was the shortcoming in their intelligence that they provided? It goes to the Department of Defense. How long did it take for them to respond or anticipate the need for the National Guard? It goes to many other elements of the executive branch, and I think we have to have the full review. But from the standpoint of, well, let me just say this. Many of our Capitol Police just acted so bravely and so with such concern for the staff, for the members, for the capital of the United States. Many of them, and they deserve our gratitude. But there was a failure of leadership at the top of the Capitol Police, and I think Mr. Sund, he hasn't even called us since this happened. So I had made aware that I would be saying that we're calling for his resignation. Now, in that score, getting back to what was underestimated, that the President of the United States would not be as insightful Perhaps somebody thought for a moment that he would be patriotic before he leaves office for just this once. So again, the fact that these people were incited, and you know what? Last night, I don't know if you heard on the floor, but some of the Republicans, in their enabling of the president's bad behavior, have said those were not Trumpites, they were Antifa invading the Capitol, disguised as Trumpites, right? So we have a problem here with the enabling that is going on with the Republicans in the Congress as well, and undermining the election, again, enabling the president, and if they don't recognize what yesterday was, a threshold was crossed of such magnitude that there is no way that this president should be allowed to make any decision to rouse any troops of his Trumpites what's next? What happens today? Who knows? But what we do know, that he must be contained. Any other questions? Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
McConnell about this? Have you spoken to Mitch McConnell about impeachment?
So I wanted to ask, for the inauguration, what are your plans? How are those changing, and how do you plan to keep members and people in the Capitol secure at that time?
Well, I'll go back to my original point. We have 13 days more of Donald Trump to deal with, who was a danger to our country. So when we talk about the inauguration, that is a national security event. And that rises to a different level of security protection. We want every day at the Capitol to be deemed a national security event, so that there's no, well, I didn't know, and blah, blah, blah. That highest level of concern, intelligence seeking, redundancy if necessary, to protect. We've been working a long time on the inauguration, and just in terms of coronavirus, another shortcoming of the president, people have died because of his denial, distortion, and the rest, calling it a hoax. This man is deadly to our democracy and to our people. But to get to your point, so because of coronavirus, in our meetings on the intelligence, on the inauguration, as far as we have jurisdiction in the Congress, but then it becomes the purview of the presidential now designee, Joe Biden. But to the point that we have that, the decision was encouraged to just have a very small inauguration. I don't want to I don't know what is in the public domain on it, but I'm not going to put that out there, except that it would be very small, and hopefully have a celebration at some later time when we're not coronavirus centered. Now, on top of that, to see what happened yesterday, if there's any, I don't want to use the word benefit because nothing could justify, but if there's anything learned about it is that we have to be very, very careful, because these people and their leader, Donald Trump, do not care about the security of people. They don't care about our democracy. They don't care about the peaceful transfer of power. Something is very, very wrong here. Now, let me just say one more thing about what he did yesterday and relating to other national security events. People saw throughout the world something that looked like it was out of a banana republic or some other kind of a third world, where the president of the country turned on the people. And what was sad about it is, of course, as members of Congress, we sign up. We sign up for the exposure that we have. But to see in the eyes of so many of the staff people, especially the younger ones, the trauma, the fright that it was for them to be locked into rooms with terrorists banging on the doors, hiding under desks, under tables, and the rest of that. They didn't sign up for that. We didn't sign them up for that. A blessing to be interested in public service, to learn from it here, perhaps to go on into public service, but to carry that important value into whatever they do in life. But to meet with them and to see how frightened they were, how traumatized they were, because these thugs, these Trump thugs, decided that they would desecrate the Capitol with no thought of what harm they might do physically, psychologically, or in any other way. And they will be prosecuted. And they will be prosecuted. Justice will be done. So in terms of the inauguration, I don't know if it could be made any smaller, but I don't trust whatever the president might have in mind, because I do not trust, because I think he's a very dangerous man. So again, we'll review what our options are in terms of the 25th Amendment, review what our options are. If he wants to be unique and be doubly impeached, that's kind of up to him and his cabinet as to whether he should stay in office. Impeached, defeated, impeached, gone. And it's really a sad tragedy for our country. I say I pray for the president every day, and I do. Last night was the hardest day for me. Night, like 5 o'clock in the morning when I finally got home, as I was praying at night, you got to keep praying for me. You've got to keep praying for me. Maybe there's some hope. But we can't take that chance because people's lives are at stake as well as our democracy. That's it for now. Thank you.
And Speaker,
There we have just heard from House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. Whenever I flipped over to her news conference, we missed the very beginning of her remarks and what she called for. And I'm going to pull this up so I can get the exact quote. She said this at the very beginning. We did not carry this particular comment because we were showing President-elect Joe Biden's news conference, but I'll bring myself up full screen so you all can hear. What Nancy Pelosi said is, quote, I join the Senate Democratic leader in calling on the Vice President to remove this president by immediately invoking the 25th Amendment. If the Vice President and Cabinet do not act, the Congress may be prepared to move forward with impeachment. And at the end there, you heard that she floated the possibility of a double impeachment for President Trump. She went on to also say that the rioters who stormed the Capitol and caused the proceedings yesterday in county electoral college votes and affirming Joe Biden's win for the presidency, she called them terrorists. Joe Biden, a little bit earlier, called them domestic terrorists as well. She also said that in referring to President Trump, she said that he must be removed from office. Although there are only 13 days left, any day can be a horror show for America. She also called for the resignation of the Capitol Police Department. Of course, yesterday, not much security was available to be able to prevent all those rioters from breaking into the Capitol building. We are, of course, following this latest news. I will tell you all that we have another press conference coming up in about 45 minutes or so now in Houston. We have learned from the Texas Department of State Health Services that more contagious strain of the coronavirus, which showed up first in the United Kingdom, it has now been detected here in Texas in Harris County. Officials are going to be talking about that. We're going to carry those remarks, so please join us as we talk about that. And what the Texas Department of State Health Services said is that they believe now that that strain is present in Texas because this person who has it had not had any travel history or anything like that. We have reporting about this already up on our website. That's KXAN.com and the KXAN News app. Please review that before we have these remarks carried to you all from Harris County. That's coming up about 2:15. We'll see you then.